Our book that we're featuring tonight particularly is the Joseph Smith Papers Documents Volume 3. And tonight we have with us Gerrit Dirkmaat and Brent Rogers, the two main editors, volume editors. And I've got to say that Brent's name's a whole lot easier to say than Gerrit's, isn't it?
You should try saying it in Dutch.
Well, do say it. What is it?
It's Gerrit.
Oh, Gerrit.
Yeah,
so we have Gerrit and Brent tonight. We're excited to have them. I want to show you something kind of funny. So this is a copy of their book. You can, I don't know if you can see it from here.
Kurt, why don't you come hold it up right in front here?
Yeah, that's right. We have an audience here. You seeing it?
Yeah. Okay,
and one of our more clever staff members is calling this the John Taylor edition. If you know, he stopped a bullet or two. And so anyway, we don't know exactly how that happened, but it's pretty funny. See what a treat you get when you come here. I just, before I talk about this specific volume and these editors a little bit, I do want to say, oh, I need that newspaper. I do want to say that we were chatting earlier, and this series is one of the most underappreciated, under-advertised, and least understood, probably, one of them in the church, but one of the most important and groundbreaking, significant efforts that the church has ever undertaken in terms of dealing with history. And there's so much value that has come out of this series. I was using the word ancillary. Whatever things have radiated from this project, including the gospel topics that are published on the church's website. The work and the expense and the time and the effort that's gone into this series is just beyond calculation. And literally tens and tens of thousands of these have sold, especially if you consider the first volume that came out. But it's been widely praised by others who do papers like this, and those who know. There was a great write-up in today's Deseret News in the Mormon Times. It's got a third of the page on the front here, and then the entire page, including a couple of really good-looking editors, on page 4, and it singles out some of the choice items that are in this volume, some of the originals, and I don't know if they were going to talk about any of those specifically, but I wanted to read what a couple of people have said, and I don't know how do you pronounce Kenneth Minkema. Minkema of the Journal of American History 100 said the Joseph Smith Papers Project would benefit not only LDS church members but also Mormon scholars and historians. In reviewing the Joseph Smith Papers, the word model comes to mind. Minkema wrote in September 2013. John Turner, who did the biography of Brigham Young, said the Joseph Smith Papers Project was the single most valuable resource for students of early Mormonism. While the bulky books aren't intended for casual reading on a vacation, they are, quote, a pleasure to behold and to study. For their attention to detail, for their abundant citation of other primary sources, for their lavish inclusion of photographs and maps, for their contextualization of Smith's prophetic career, the JSP is indeed a great and marvelous work, Turner wrote last September. The Joseph Smith Papers Project matches the audacity of its subject. Presidents and poets, ministers and marchers can only hope for similar treatment. So that's quite a tribute. Well, we're very grateful tonight to have Gerrit Dirkmaat, who has a PhD in history from University of Colorado. He worked for several years, I guess officially, as historian and writer for the Joseph Smith Papers Project. And now you're doing it as a volunteer? Is that,
Yeah.
Is that, okay. He was a volume co-editor of Documents Volume 1 and the lead volume editor of this volume 3. Is now an assistant professor of church history and doctrine at BYU, and as I said, is a volunteer historian and writer on the project, and is currently working on administrative volume 1. And that's the one that has the Council of 50 Minutes, is that right?
It is the council.
Okay. So Brent Rogers received degrees from San Diego State, California State University at Sacramento, and a PhD in 19th century United States history from University of Nebraska at Lincoln. He previously served as a digital editor and research fellow for the Papers of William F. Cody, and as an instructor in the history department at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and has produced scholarship on digital history, history of the American West, and Mormon history. And again, I've gone too long, but thank you so much for coming, and I'm going to turn the time over to our editors now, and then we'll have questions and answers, and then go from there.
Did everybody get one of these that has all the volumes to date on it? Yeah.
I'm pretty much a loudspeaker.
Is this in the way?
No, I didn't get it.
Whereabouts?
Right there.
Right there?
Right there.
Well, as Skipper pointed out, we're the eye candy for the Joseph Smith Papers, obviously. We're maybe more Brent than me. I have to apologize, I lost my voice earlier this week, which is especially problematic when you are a professor teaching classes. So I sound pretty raspy up here a little bit, and I sound like I've smoked for 40 years. That's not true, because I've only smoked for 20. But there is a great breadth of items that are in Documents Volume 3. It covers the period from February of 1833 to March 1834. There are multiple types of documents. In the first Documents Volume that I worked on, Documents Volume 1, and really Documents Volume 2 is similar as well, many of the existing documents are revelations. And the reason why most of them are revelations is those are the ones that had some staying power before they really are making a concerted effort to maintain their documents. And so Documents Volume 3 has a much greater diversity. You have your a little over a dozen revelations, sure, you have those, but you also have more letters, both to and from Joseph Smith. You have more minutes of meetings that he's involved in. The minutes that are included are ones in which Joseph takes an active part. There's licenses like we have in others, but there are also some unique documents. For instance, one document that caused us a great deal of research and consternation was a small note that Joseph Smith penned to Newell K. Whitney, telling him that Philassus Hurlbut was trying to get control of a farm. And it's a little note, it's penned, it's at the University of Utah Special Collections, but there's almost no background surrounding it. You have a few lines on a note, you know a few of the names, but then trying to figure out what farm are they talking about. There's no date on this note, when was this note written, required all kinds of research to go into that. We are, if any of you are familiar with the Joseph Smith Papers and the project, you realize that we are very much blessed with the resources of the Gail and Larry Miller Foundation, as well as the church in providing the resources that allow us to research these in ways that we might not. And of course, working at the Church History Archives, we have pretty ready access to many of these documents. And in some cases, it means we have access that at least faster or more ready access than we would otherwise as researchers. So some of the things in the volume are things that, might seem fairly familiar to people, but with a much deeper historical examination. One of the ones, for example, is the Word of Wisdom, Doctrine and Covenants, section 89, as it's known now. This is, probably one of the single most recognizable facets of Mormonism today. In fact, I could make a joke starting off about it, right? Because of how recognizable that idea is. And so we've been able to actually utilize some previously unavailable sources in our analysis of this document. For instance, in Documents Volume 3, we were able to use part of the yet unpublished Council of 50 Minutes. So the very first glimpse into what's contained in the Nauvoo era Council of 50 Minutes, the first citation to it is in Documents Volume 3 in the Word of Wisdom. And what it is, it's a statement of Joseph Smith very near the end of his life. This is in May of 1844, and the topic of drinking comes up, and so I'll just read a little bit of this to you here. Joseph said, "We should never indulge our appetites to injure our influence or wound the feelings of friends, or cause the Spirit of the Lord to leave us. There is no excuse for any man to drink and get drunk in the Church of Christ, or gratify any appetite or lust contrary to the principles of righteousness. On the principles of sobriety and everything pertaining to godliness, and at considerable length," Joseph continued speaking, "on the principles of sobriety and everything that pertained to godliness at considerable length, and concluded by remarking that it was best to run a long race and be careful to keep a good wind." So there are some sources that we're able to use to contextualize these documents and provide an understanding of how they were viewed over time that I think are previously unavailable, and at least a new way of examining them. Another document that's similar to that, I'm going to get back over here.
Yeah,
Don't worry, I'm on my way. Doctrine and Covenants section 91 is another revelation for which I think a new and unique way of examining it has been brought forth. This is the revelation that deals with the Apocrypha. It's not one that you probably spend a whole lot of time in if you're in your Mormon Sunday school class. For most people in the church today, they essentially ignore the Apocrypha. And so the question becomes, why is this revelation devoted to this? And so we provide a historical examination of this. Why is it that Joseph's even asking a question about the Apocrypha? Well, in Joseph's time, just prior to the time when he founds the church, in 1826, 27, and 28, there was a very loud, very public debate among the British and Foreign Bible Society, which was responsible for printing and distributing many of the Bibles in the world, and its sister institution, which was the American and Foreign Bible Society, which did the same thing. An argument about whether or not the Apocrypha, these books that were traditionally part of the Catholic canon, these books that were written, we're familiar with some of them, especially around Hanukkah time, right, with Maccabees and Esdras, we often have quoted. But these several books, which were a part of the Jewish tradition, accepted into Catholic canon, but were questioned by Protestant authors and reformers who had come to rely solely on Scripture. So that when Martin Luther does his German translation of the Bible, he's going to take time to say, all right, he includes them, but he also separates them and makes them different. As time goes on, the acceptance or rejection of the Apocrypha starts to become a very loud and public idea, until the British and Foreign Bible Society is saying, why are we publishing these fake scriptures in our Bibles that we're sending out? I know that they're in the King James, that they're traditional, but we should take them out. There's a big rift among the society. And in 1828, finally the decision is made to get rid of it. And so the Bible that Joseph is using to translate the Bible is one of the few that's published in America that still contain the Apocrypha. Now, of course, you could still get it, but the general Bible that was in usage, the American Bible Society is going to make the same decision the British Bible Society decided. We're going to be more Protestant, and therefore we're going to cast doubt on the Apocrypha. You can read newspaper articles in Ohio from the time. Prominent Presbyterian ministers like William Craig Brownlee are inveighing against the Catholic Church for still using the Apocrypha. And so this idea of whether or not the Apocrypha should be treated as Scripture by Joseph Smith is a very natural question given the surrounding context of the world that he's in. Also, Doctrine and Covenants section 90 specifically told them that some of the things that he is going to be doing, taking the lead of the School of the Prophets, will happen after he has finished his translation of the Bible. So it's a very natural question then, what does that entail? And with a world surrounding him that is questioning whether or not the Apocrypha should or should not be included in the Bible, with a pressing need to get past the translation of the Bible so that he can go to other things he's been commanded to do, it becomes a natural question, is the Apocrypha part of it? And of course you know that the Revelation fairly cryptically says, well, there's good parts of it and there's parts that aren't, and so you don't need to translate it, but one might think, well, that's very similar to what the Lord had to tell him about the Bible itself. But anyway, there's deeper insights into a lot of the documents that we examine. One of the things that we talked about the other day was there are two locales that are being represented in this book. And yes, in Documents Volume 1 in 1831, 1832, there are a locale in Missouri and a locale in Kirtland. But this it becomes much more pressing, the difficulties, the logistical difficulties involved in having a large body of the church membership 1,000 miles away from the headquarters of the church, which is a problem in the best of circumstances, where you have carping and fighting over what should or shouldn't happen, and when you try to appeal to a higher authority, well, you're not going to find out about it for another 2 months, let alone, if you're lucky, it might be 3 months, and then when you find out, it might be the opposite of what you were doing in the first place. But these aren't going to be the best of times. I've said that looking at this volume, you could look at this as the first half of the volume is what's going on in their times of peace. They're trying to expand Kirtland. So many of the documents here involve minutes of meetings where they have these grandiose ideas of buying up every farm in the center of Kirtland. They can't even afford one of the farms in the center of Kirtland, but they're planning on buying half a dozen of them. That very quickly is going to give way to almost a defense mechanism of trying to preserve what they have rather than thoughts of expansion. By the summertime in Kirtland, the anti-Mormon campaign led by Dr. Philassus Hurlbut, who's been excommunicated from the church by June twice, the end of June. Those minutes of his excommunication are in this book as well. Is going to be supported by other leading anti-Mormon editors like Eber D. Howe, and there is a great rhetorical and legal attempt to restrict the growth of Mormonism in the Kirtland area. Howe's going to publish publication after publication about what he believes is the farce that Mormonism is portraying upon people, perpetrating upon people. But there's also legal means taken, and one of these legal means is an attempt to, through using a legal trick, essentially, of warning Mormon residents of the township out to prevent them from being able to obtain legal status in the township. Now, why do you do that? Well, you do that because if you don't have legal status in the township, you can't vote in the township. And if you can't vote in the township, then that means the township trustees, the overseers, they're going to stay out of Mormon hands no matter how many Mormons keep moving into the area. Howe, like Governor Ford many years later, will opine over and over again in his reminiscences that the primary problem with the Mormons is that people were worried that they would get political power, and that once they have the power to vote, that they're going to vote in numbers that will drive other people out of their existing political power. So those documents are covered there as well. The documents that might be familiar to some of you, but covered in detail, are the demands made by the Jackson County mobbers when they present their ultimatum to the church members. In fact, so we have a letter that's sent from the members of the church there, and again with supporting annotation to help people understand what's going on. Missourians weren't terribly fond of Mormons. That's probably an understatement. But it really became clear as Brent and I researched these documents that the real touchstone here, the real problem, the real straw that broke the camel's proverbial back is this article that's published by W.W. Phelps that's taken by the Missourians the way they interpret. Now, Phelps claims he didn't mean this, but he's also claiming that after the fact. But the Missourians take it as being an article that is inviting free blacks who are members of the church to move to Missouri and settle there. And so while the Mormons have believed that Jackson County's their Zion for 2 years, while they've been buying lands up, while they've been, according to Missourians, pretending to have visions of God, those things were all fine, right up until the point when they felt that their social system of slavery was threatened. And this is in the aftermath of probably the worst and most tragic slave rebellion in American history. The Nat Turner Slave Rebellion occurs in 1832 in Virginia. It ends in the death of dozens of people, and most of those who rebelled. But the horrific nature of this, what Nat Turner had undertaken, was essentially a race war. He believed he had received communication from God to kill every white person he could. And so this became a horror story told over and over and over again by the racist slaveholders in the South, who feared their slaves overpowering them, getting ideas about freedom, getting ideas that they could become free, and if they couldn't become free legally, to become free violently. Many of the southern states, the new southern states, passed laws making it illegal for Southerners, for slave owners, to free their slaves. That if you were going to free your slave, you had to pay to transport them out of the state, and if they ever came back, you were the one that would be fined for their return. They wanted to create an utterly stratified society, a society in which there is no question, if you are black, that means slave. And so the idea, first of all, that there are black members of this new crazy Mormon church is hateful enough. That you would invite them to this slave state is all the more egregious. And as I'll read a little bit of what they have to say here. Their conduct here stamps their character in their true colors. More than a year since, it was ascertained that they had been tampering. This is the article. Should I move this down a little bit? I've got a loud enough voice, don't I? I think probably we'll be okay. This is the ultimatum that is presented to the Mormons for the reason why they have to leave immediately from the county by this self-appointed mob. I mean, these are not local officials. This is a group of people who got together and said, "That's it. We saw the publication, and it's time to get rid of them." More than a year since, it was ascertained that they had been tampering with our slaves and endeavoring to sow dissensions and raise seditions among them. Of this, the Mormon leaders were informed, and they said that they would deal with any of their members who should again, in like case, offend. But how specious are appearances! In a late Star, published in Independence by the leaders of the sect, there is an article inviting free Negroes and mulattoes from other states to become Mormons and remove and settle among us. This exhibits them in still more odious colors. It manifests a desire on the part of their society to inflict on our society an injury that they know would be to us entirely unsupportable, and one of the surest means of driving us from the county. For it would require none of their supernatural gifts that they pretend to see that the introduction of such a caste amongst us would corrupt our blacks and instigate them to bloodshed. They return to this again as being the primary cause of their decision to take violent action. So this is also detailed in the volume, as well as Joseph Smith's attempt to respond to it. The difficulties encountered reveal Joseph Smith in multiple different ways. We have minutes of meetings in which he's giving sermons, right, in a kind of public sphere. We have more private reflections. We have letters that are written to the entire church, letters written to comfort the church in Missouri. But we also have letters that are written to individuals, to counsel them, to settle disputes, to provide comfort. And I think in looking at these, you get a much more complete view of Joseph Smith, the person, as well as Joseph Smith, the leader of this religious movement. So I'm going to turn my time, well, my time was over a long time ago, but I'm going to turn whatever time we all have left on this earth to Brent, so he can talk about some of these letters.
Looks like you're going to prom.
Yeah, I feel like I'm putting a corsage on it. It's not the first time.
Thank you, Gerrit, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's great to be able to address you. So, some of the best insights that I think we can gain into the life and personality of Joseph Smith and those of his contemporaries is through reading correspondence. And in Documents Volume 3, out of the 88 documents that we have there, 33 of those are letters to or from Joseph Smith. So you get to see a lot of very interesting correspondence, some things that Joseph Smith is dealing with, and church members and even non-members that he corresponds with, how they're dealing with the similar circumstances. So I want to talk just a little bit about a couple of the letters found in Documents Volume 3. The first one is a letter written on 12 February 1833. This is Joseph Smith writing to Noah C. Saxton, who is the editor of a newspaper in Rochester, New York, called the American Revivalist and Rochester Observer. Now this letter that's in our volume is the second letter that Joseph Smith wrote to this newspaper editor in just over a month. He had written one on January 4th that he wanted Noah Saxton to print in its entirety in the paper. He was responding to an open invitation that the editor wrote in his paper that said, "We cheerfully open our columns to the free discussion and critical investigation of the doctrines and duties of Christianity." And so Joseph Smith was a subscriber to this newspaper and took this invitation and wrote a letter, which was one of the first ones he wrote for that he intended for a broader public. And he outlined in that the core principles and beliefs of the church that he had founded. He wrote in that letter that he considered its contents so important that he was willing to expose his own weaknesses as a writer, quote, "to step forth into the field to tell you that what the Lord is doing and what you must do to enjoy the smiles of your Savior in these last days," end quote. So he sends the letter to the editor, and in the second February 1833 issue of the newspaper, when Joseph Smith receives it, he sees that only the last two paragraphs are included in the newspaper. And this is what Saxton wrote to preface the letter. He wrote that he did not include the entirety of the letter because of a lack of space and its inconsistencies with his own views of truth. So Joseph received this, and probably either, we don't know exactly when he received it because he doesn't write it, but the 2 February issue coming out of Rochester probably took a couple of days to get there, so it was pretty much right after he received this, he wrote a follow-up letter, and it was a pretty stern letter where he encourages Saxton to publish the letter in its entirety, and this is what he writes. He says, "Dear Sir, I was somewhat disappointed on receiving my paper with only a part of my letter inserted in it. The letter which I wrote you for publication I wrote by the commandment of God, and I am quite anxious to have it all laid before the public, for it is of importance to them. But I have no claim upon you, neither do I wish to urge you beyond that which is reasonable to do. I have only to appeal to your extended generosity to all religious societies that claim that Christ has come in the flesh, and also tell you what will be the consequences of a neglect to publish it. And the letter continues. So this letter, I think, reveals Joseph Smith's frustration with Saxton's decision not to publish his entire message. And it shows an effort on Joseph Smith's part to try to make his contemporaries and the people of the time, and particularly the subscribers of this newspaper, understand the importance, what he felt to be the importance of his message. Joseph Smith's letter, second letter to Noah Saxton, did not elicit any response. In fact, the newspaper never mentioned Joseph Smith or Mormonism ever again. So maybe he still wasn't quite getting through to Mr. Saxton. But so that's one, I think, very interesting letter that is in this volume. Another is a letter that Joseph Smith wrote to his uncle Silas in September 1833. And in this letter, he defends and kind of expounds upon the idea of modern and continuing revelation. So Silas Smith resided in the Stockholm, New York area, and several of Joseph Smith's extended family lived in the area as well, including his grandmother, Mary Smith, and his uncles Jesse and, is it Ashel? How do you pronounce that? Anybody? Oh, yeah. All right. Well, I probably should have left that one out if I couldn't pronounce it right. Yeah. And their families lived there. So Silas was a Presbyterian at the time, and he was aware of his nephew's revelations and of the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith Sr. and Don Carlos Smith had gone and visited Silas and other family members in 1830 and told them, gave them their testimony of the Book of Mormon and of Joseph Smith as prophet. But according to Silas Smith's son, who wrote later, he said that his father was slow about yielding obedience to the gospel owing to the determined opposition of his wife, Mary Akins, and his brother Jesse. Jesse Smith was a pretty ardent opponent of Joseph Smith. In fact, he wrote a letter to Hiram in 1829 that was quite scathing, in which he says, quote, "Uncle Jesse did and still does think the whole pretended discovery not a very deep but a very clear and foolish deception, a very great wickedness, unpardonable, unless you are shielded by your ignorance." And there's a lot more to that 1829 letter that I won't get into. So it's interesting that Joseph Smith may have had, this is in 1833, so a couple of years after his father and brother went and talked to Silas, but he waits until 1833 to send this letter. Perhaps he feared a similar vitriol as his other uncle had given him. So he, in this 26 September 1833 letter, attempts to persuade his uncle that is both scripturally sound and reasonable that God would speak to prophets in modern times as he did in biblical times. Most Christians believed that the canon of Scripture was closed and found the idea of additional canonical revelation to be blasphemous and repugnant. And so this letter, as you read it, I think is an early and prime example of the Mormon argument for modern and continuing revelation. And in the letter, Joseph Smith heavily references books from the Old and New Testament to demonstrate that each age needs to hear the voice of God anew. So one of the things he writes, he says, quote, "If one man can live upon the revelations to another, might I not with propriety ask, why the necessity then of the Lord speaking to Isaac as he did, as is recorded in the 26th chapter of Genesis? For the Lord there repeats, or rather promises again to perform the oath which he had previously sworn to Abraham. And why this repetition to Isaac? Why was not the first promise as sure for Isaac as it was for Abraham? Was not Isaac Abraham's son, and could he not place implicit confidence in the veracity of his father as being a man of God?" And then he continues, and he says, after he kind of goes through a number of biblical examples of why these biblical figures needed to hear new, similar and new revelation from God, he says, "Or must I not rather obtain for myself by my own faith and diligence in keeping the commandments of the Lord, an assurance of salvation for myself, and have I not an equal privilege with the ancient saints? And will not the Lord hear my prayers, and listen to my cries as soon as he ever did to theirs, if I come to him in the manner they did? Or is he a respecter of persons? He closed his letter by inviting Silas to come join him and the other members of the Smith family in Kirtland, and hopes that he would be converted to the church. And so Joseph Smith is reaching out to a family member, and at the same time spreading, his convicted belief in the restoration of the gospel. And so he encapsulates a rationale for this belief in continuing revelation, that new revelations or communications from God came in each dispensation and were required for each age in their peculiar circumstances to help them adapt. And so eventually Silas Smith does join the church, is baptized by Hiram Smith in 1835, and then later emigrated with Mary Smith, Joseph Smith's grandmother, to Kirtland. I'm sure we could talk about a whole bunch of other letters, but maybe it'd be better to get to your questions. And so I just want to close, just say that I think these letters in Documents Volume 3 give great insight into Joseph Smith's mind and his character. They also reveal his conviction in his prophetic mission and the efforts he made to spread the message of the restored gospel, even in times of great trial, as he was trying to figure out, as Gerrit said, how to lead this church that was growing in two different places. There were two church centers, but also growing in Vermont, in Indiana, in places in New York, in Canada. You see this kind of expansion in Documents Volume 3 of the church in all these places, and so he's trying to lead and manage this, and at the same time personally fulfill the mission that he felt he needed to. So thank you again for having us here tonight, and thank you for allowing me to share a few documents from Documents Volume 3.
How do you want us to take questions? We're going to pass the mic back and forth?
Yeah,
or?
probably be the easiest.
Okay.
I was totally unaware that the church was actively recruiting blacks in around the Nat Turner time. I'd never heard that before. So, question is, are these black slaves, mulattoes, were they baptized, and were they given the opportunity to have the priesthood?
Unfortunately, I don't think we have very good sources for the time period. I will say there is an 1837 black abolitionist newspaper that writes about this same, it's a very anti-Mormon article that it writes, and part of what it writes is that there are far too many of our people that have come under this sway and joined that church. I mean, there were blacks baptized into the early church. What you see, of course, from Missourians is a reaction to something that hasn't yet happened, right? I mean, although there may have been blacks outside of, everyone's familiar with Black Pete in Kirtland, right? So there may have been more that had been baptized. Really, the Missourians are reacting to the idea, and really, when you look at it, even given the paucity of evidence, I mean, we don't have long membership lists, and we certainly don't have heritage lists for many of the people that we have their names once or something like that. The very fact that Phelps is writing the article at all suggests he's writing it for a reason, right? The fact that he's addressing a free black population suggests that there's some reason why he's doing it. The fact that this newspaper devoted to free people of color feels the need to run an anti-Mormon attack piece claiming the ridiculousness of Mormonism and to keep blacks from joining this deluded church, as it calls it, again suggests there's something going on. Otherwise, it's a weird reaction to claim it. But of course, we do know of some early members of the church. I think we just know of them more in the Nauvoo period than in the early Kirtland period.
But we have no official church membership records from that era.
No. We have anecdotal evidence of some people who get mentioned in certain things, but I mean, there's not like a baptism list that has everyone who's baptized into the church from
Well,
that
is it
time.
possible that the church didn't keep track of what the race was?
They still don't.
That's a good point. Yeah, I would say it would be very unlikely. I mean, part of the problem is most Protestant churches. I mean, there are Second Great Awakening church movements that are fairly liberal in their inclusion of African Americans into their congregations, such as the Shakers. But in general, the idea of having African Americans as members of the same church to begin with was pretty foreign to most of these. That's the reason why there's, an African Methodist Episcopal Church as well as a Methodist Episcopal Church, right? There is a general separation, and so I think that there's probably something to the fact that for a Missourian, it's not only just that they're going to be bringing free blacks into the territory. It just further heightens their anger against the religion as an absurdity itself, that Mormons are allowing blacks to be a part of it, which is the way they interpret Phelps's article. So, unfortunately, we are dealing with a period that just has so few sources, and especially when it comes to individual members.
Well, did the church, when they left Ohio and Missouri, and then went to Nauvoo, and came west, did they bring all of their temple sealing records and all of the other? Because I know
there are some records, sure, that make it.
today's church is really big on ordinance records.
By the Nauvoo period, you have much better record keeping, and you have people assigned to those purposes, and so yeah, you have much better records by the time you're in Nauvoo. I mean, and really, that's kind of how you're going to see the Joseph Smith Papers unfold. This book covers a little over a year. There's a lot. It's kind of heavy. You don't want to let it fall on you. If you fall asleep reading it, you break your nose. But it's fairly substantial. But it covers over a year period. By the time we get to, say, 1843 in Nauvoo, you're going to be looking at a volume that will at best cover maybe 5 months. I would say 4 is probably more likely, because there are so many more records that still are extant. And so when we know of documents that we know existed but don't exist now, we tell you in the book. There's a calendar of documents in each book, and part of that calendar of documents includes not extant documents.
The calendar of documents is online.
Oh, it's online now.
It was in each book, but it started getting to be a little too big, so we made it a web resource.
We're trying to make the book lighter. But
Well, how did they get all of those records out on the trek west? I mean, I was brought up to believe that they were driven out in the dead of winter from Nauvoo, and that was the myth, I guess. But obviously there was a lot of wagons and other things, maybe trains. Well, the trains didn't come in for 3 decades after, but how did they get all of that physical evidence or records out
they already have essentially a historian's office. By that time, Willard Richards is already in charge, has an office of trying to create the church history. And so because he is doing that, because they're already crafting, at the time it's Joseph Smith history, but it's later going to be what we call the history of the church, many of the documents are already essentially at his disposal. There's an office where they already have them. And so what they're really doing for most of the church's documents is they're packing up the historian's office, and it goes out to Utah as part of the wagon train. And so there's actually a time gap in between when they pack it up and when they feel safe enough to unpack it when they get out there. So there is a little bit of lag time, but that's how most of those documents end up remaining, the ones that were already a part of the historian's office.
Do you have any guess about how many wagons it took for these documents? I mean, this is the era before flash drives.
I have no idea. I would guess that it was fairly substantial, including the press as well. Did you have a? Go ahead.
Well, I think we had a couple of...
Oh, back here.
I had a question about the creation of the letters. The letters that are attributed to Joseph, there are those that are in his handwriting, right? But that's a small minority of the extant letters.
That's correct.
Is that right?
Most of the letters that are featured in Documents Volume 3 and I think even in the earlier documents, volumes come from the letter books, which are copied before they're sent out. They're copied in by a scribe into the letter book. We do have a
Have you been able to come up with, well, let's see. I'm curious to know if you think that the letters that are attributed to Joseph Smith were dictated by Joseph Smith, or were drafted by scribes and then Joseph Smith revised them?
I think that's a great question. My sense is, from what I know from this period, is that the few that we have that were sent or received copies are in Joseph Smith's hand. Mm-hmm. So my guess is that he's writing most of the ones that are sent, but the ones that are copied in and maintained in the letter book are done by a scribe. Mm-hmm. So one of the documents in Documents Volume 3 is a letter dated August 18, 1833, and that's a letter that Joseph writes to the church leaders in Missouri after he's found out about the July violence in Jackson County, and that was a copy kept by Edward Partridge, and that's all written in Joseph Smith's hand. We have another letter that I think Joseph started copying into the letter book, which was finished by Frederick G. Williams, and that's a letter that he writes to John Sims Carter on April 13th. So my sense for this period, and maybe it changes as we move on. I haven't thought about that, but this is just I'm thinking kind of on the fly here.
There's some pretty long letters too, aren't there, later on?
Absolutely.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the December 10 letter,
The December 10 letter is a substantial letter.
It's a substantial letter, and I'm fairly certain that Joseph Smith either dictated or wrote it outright.
Hurlbut and Howe were assembling documents at this time to publish a book.
Yeah.
Was Joseph Smith aware of that, and was he concerned with what was going on? They were actually going back to Palmyra.
Right, during the time period that's covered.
Knew some of the
right.
Some of the things Joseph Smith was doing when he lived in Palmyra.
During the time period covered by this volume, I don't know that Joseph is aware that Howe's ultimate plan is to publish a book on it.
I think the book was published in 1834.
It is published in 34, but after really it's going to come out after the time period covered in this volume. However, they do know that he is essentially being paid by anti-Mormon individuals to conduct speaking tours and to try to collect negative accusations. So they know already that Hurlbut is making a concerted effort, and so there are multiple documents in this volume that refer to that, where Joseph Smith talks about that Hurlbut is lying about us in a wonderful manner, and people are falling all over themselves, throwing money at him in an effort to break down Mormonism. And so it is certainly a very chief concern. It almost seems like, though, Joseph's greater concern is that Hurlbut is actually a dangerous character physically, because by January, really by the end of 1833, by October, Joseph is making accusations against Hurlbut that Hurlbut is threatening to kill him. Hurlbut's threatening to kill Joseph, kill his family. This note that I talked about earlier is part of Hurlbut's accusation to try and file a lawsuit against Joseph Smith. We have some later records, right? George A. Smith is going to say that what Hurlbut was saying, that he was going to wash his hands in the blood of Joseph Smith. Now that might be hyperbole, it might be over the top, but at the same time, a non-Mormon judge hears this case and rules that there is sufficient cause for Joseph Smith to be scared by the accusations that have been made, rules against Hurlbut, forces him to pay a huge bond and a pretty substantial court costs. So that is going on during this time period. That they are aware the extent to which Howe is trying to collect these affidavits to put them in a concerted anti-Mormon book. I don't think they know. I mean, it hasn't really, there's no commentary on it in any of their documents, but they are well aware that the primary enemies of the church in Kirtland are Hurlbut and Howe.
Can I point out that just interesting that his first name is Doctor?
He is Doctor, yeah.
It's not a title.
No, but he's actually not educated at all. And in fact, Eber Howe.
Well, not many doctors were very.
Right, especially a doctor back then. But Eberhau describes him as full of gab and very illiterate. Well, that's I mean, that's probably how people would describe me, I guess. But they yeah, it was a practice, not a terribly common practice, but I guess, I mean, it was a way of giving him great credence. In fact, people over the course of time have always assumed that Dr. Philastus Hurlbut was some person educated in what he was doing. I've always joked that I should name my next son MVP of the NBA Finals Dirkmaat, so, you know, then people can...
But I have a grandson whose name is Senator, so...
And that is... Yeah.
Hopefully it isn't Hatch.
Well, just going back to his question about the preservation of the documents, today on our website we posted a summary of a release event we got to go to Monday where we got to see some of the original documents that are addressed in this book. And, you know, some of them are huge. They're gigantic, and they're in incredible shape considering they're nearly 200 years old. So, luckily, things like that did survive. But then, Brent, I would like you to talk a little bit about Vienna Jakes and who she was in her letter, because I think she's so interesting.
Okay. So, yeah, Vienna Jakes is one of the people that we got to learn quite a bit about in researching Documents Volume 3. We see her in a couple of places in the volume. The first one is in a revelation dated 8 March 1833, which is now canonized as Doctrine and Covenants Section 90. She's one of only 2 women that are mentioned by name, or named in the Doctrine and Covenants. She had donated a pretty substantial amount of money to the church at this time, right around the giving of that revelation. She is commanded to go to Jackson County. So she grew up and owns a couple of properties in the Boston area in Massachusetts, and came to Kirtland in 1831, was baptized after she met Joseph Smith and learned of the Book of Mormon. Let's see, she helped Samuel Smith and some others create a church branch in the Boston area before then moving to Kirtland in late 32. So she gets commanded by this revelation to go to Jackson County, and eventually leaves Kirtland, arrives in Jackson County around the 7th of June, and just 5 weeks later is when the violence against church members in Jackson County breaks out. And Vienna Jakes is a witness to some of the major events there. She's near the printing office when mobbers come in and kind of throw the Book of Commands pages out the window, and the printing press and all the printing furniture and type and all those things that are thrown out and then as the building is destroyed. And she is in the streets trying to pick up these pages of the Book of Commandments, and she has an account where she mentions some of the, what had happened, and she says that as she's picking up the pages, a member of the Jackson County mob comes up to her and says, "Madam, this is only a prelude of what you have to suffer." And so it seems like a pretty terrifying thing to go to Jackson County, where you're supposed to get an inheritance by revelation, and just a few weeks after arriving there, she is a witness to a pretty terrifying event of violence. And so she wrote a letter to Joseph Smith sometime after her arrival, and we're not sure when, because in the letter that Joseph writes back to her, so we don't have the letter that she wrote, but we do have Joseph Smith's response. He just mentions receiving the letter, not its date or anything like that, and he writes a letter of comfort and gratitude, and then he passes along some information to some of the other church members and leaders through her to them in Jackson County. And so she's I think a pretty significant part of the story that you'll find if you read Documents Volume 3.
I would just add to that I mean, Vienna is a great microcosm, a great small story of the number of stories that are occurring over and over and over again. Whatever anyone thinks about Mormonism today or then, one of the more powerful aspects of it, and something that that has been commented on by other non-Mormon historians, is that the depth of conversion among people allowed many of them to suffer great, incredible difficulties. And Vienna Jakes, you're looking at someone who is a well-off woman, a upper middle class at least. It seems like more than that, given her property ownings. And she essentially donates all of her property to the church. She moves from Boston, donates all of her property to the church, goes to go find this promised land of Zion because a prophet commands her in a revelation to go, after leaving everything, after giving everything to the church. And when she gets there, she's not there for weeks before they're driven violently out of this supposed promised land of Zion. And that cataclysmic event, that turn of event after you've walked 1,000 miles to get to the land of Zion that is not as friendly as it was portrayed to be, is not something that causes her to lose her faith. She's driven out of Jackson County into this, becomes a refugee in one of the surrounding counties, is going to be a part of the larger driving out in Missouri in 1838 and 39, and then to Nauvoo, and from Nauvoo on to Utah. Her depth of conversion is such that she not only sacrifices all of her material possessions for the church, but she maintains this faithfulness despite the level of persecution and physical hardships that she maintains. And so, I think we both find her to be an incredibly inspiring woman. Mormon or not, someone can't read her story of faith and devotion and not marvel at how committed she was in the space of just overwhelming persecution.
Okay, let's give him a hand.
Oh, got one.
I have one more. It's
Right, just under the...
one more. It's kind of off the topic of the volume, but it's on the topic of Council of 50. I wondered if there were any details you could share about how that minutes became available for research and publication.
Boy, I'm probably not the best person to talk about it. I know that they've done multiple publications and press events where they've talked about it, and I'd probably refer you to those where they talk more about them. I will say that I think it's a part of the larger effort to make the Joseph Smith papers as inclusive as possible. My experience working there and continuing to work with them since I've been there is that there's nothing that's been made off limits to me at all. There's nothing that I've requested that I've not been able to use, and every volume is what is there on the page, and so I think I'd probably refer you to Matt Groh or to Rick Turley and some of the press events they've done where they've talked about that as a process, because they were more involved in it. It's above my pay grade, and especially now that I'm a volunteer, it's way above it. But I do think it is a monumental thing that these documents are going to be made available, because as I read to you tonight, there are some teachings of Joseph Smith that are essentially previously unknown. Understandings of mindsets of individuals, and not just Joseph, of the things that are going on. And if you're a Mormon, if you're a religious person, then it can be an area of faith. If you're just someone interested in studying the religion as history, or if you're interested in this development, again, fascinating to have these documents either way.
Okay, I think that's...
We'll shut her down, and then
we're past time.
we'll still be here.
Yeah.